Welcome everyone. You're here for the third part of this webinar series, and we are going to be discussing China's secret space program in terms of what's happening today, whether it's a global threat or an opportunity. Now, we've got people from all over the world tuning in, so thanks to all of you, wherever you are. We are here in Hawaii, broadcasting out of the Big Island on the Kailua side, and right now, as I speak, there is a big hurricane heading towards us, Hurricane Douglas. So if at any point we experience difficulties or I cut out, you know the hurricane got us. So I'm just decked out in my hurricane jacket here, and we will ride through this. So I know not all of you attended part 1 and part 2, so I'll just do a very quick recap of what we discussed in part 1 and part 2, just for the benefit of those that weren't here. Now, in part 1, we covered the origins and the history of China's secret space programs, and I focused a lot of attention on a Chinese scientist by the name of Dr. Shen Shen. And the importance of him in the origins of China's secret space program was that he was involved with helping the US Air Force start up its secret space program. And so what occurred was that he helped write the blueprints for the secret space program that the Air Force was starting to research and develop in the 1940s. So he wrote the blueprints for that. He was part of the team getting all of the data and putting that into different papers that were then developed by Air Force scientists and engineers over the succeeding decades. Then in the 1950s, in a really dramatic development, he was deported to China. And the basic reason I gave for that, what I discussed, was that the deep state wanted him to go to China with all of this information. So he did. He went to China, brought with him all of the information about ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, flying saucers, the Air Force's plans to develop a secret space program, took them all back with him to China in 1955. And he became the father of China's space programs, both its conventional rocket program. Just 2 days ago, China sent the Tianhui rocket to Mars. So all of that can be traced directly back to Dr. Shen Shen, because he's considered the father of China's rocket program, but also of their secret space program. The important thing to keep in mind here for what we're going to be discussing today is that because of his knowledge of what the Air Force had done and his participation in writing the blueprint for the Air Force's secret space program, that meant that later on, as China got the latest data on what the US Air Force was doing, he and the people around him were able to quickly translate that into new blueprints for China to develop its own space program, its own secret space program, based on what it was now learning the Air Force and the NRO were doing in space, just because China's spies were able to bring in fresh information. So Dr. Shen, right up until his death around early 2000s, continued to play a very important role in China's secret space program and what it is today. In the second webinar, we discussed China's pyramids, its links to ancient civilizations, and also extraterrestrial contact, and how China was able to get access to all of this ancient technology, all of this ancient information. And that is something that China is hoping will help it bridge the technology gap with the US secret space program. That China's ace hole here, or one of China's aces, is the ancient technologies that are buried in China's pyramids, that China is able to gain access to and reverse engineer. So that's a kind of very quick recap on what we did the previous 2 weeks. But today we're going to be looking at China's secret space program in terms of what it constitutes for the United States and the rest of the planet. Is it a global threat, or is it an opportunity for all of us? So we're going to begin the slideshow now. So let me move over here to this camera, and we are going to now get into one of the key things that is going to help you understand the thinking behind the Chinese regime. We know it's run by a communist party, but the people running the communist party, they are individuals who get a lot of inspiration, a lot of ideas from Chinese history, especially when we're talking about military affairs. As far as military doctrine and strategy is concerned, the Chinese Communist Party today and the People's Liberation Army gain a lot of information from this. Oops, there we go. So this is the period of the warring states. And as you can see there were roughly 6 major kingdoms, half a dozen kingdoms. I mean, there were more to begin with. And these kingdoms fought against each other roughly from the period of around 450 BC up until 222 BC, when the Qin emperor conquered all of the other kingdoms, all of the other Chinese states. So all of the peoples that made up these different warring states, they were ethnically very similar, Han Chinese, so the language is very similar, ethnically no major differences, but they were all ruled by multiple kingdoms that battled one another. And these battles over the course of 250 years led to many strategies, many ideas on how to subjugate your adversaries. So for Chinese military strategists, they look to this period of the warring states and get a lot of their inspiration for how to deal with adversaries. Whether you're a dominant state and are looking for strategies on how to keep other states subjugated, or whether you are a subjugated state and you're looking for strategies for how to overcome a more powerful state, then this period of the warring states is really critical. So now what we do is look at one of the key figures, probably the dominant figure when it comes to understanding the thinking of the Chinese military strategist and the thinking of Communist Party elites at the moment in China. And that is Sun Tzu, and he wrote the book The Art of War, and this was written in the period just preceding the period of the warring states. And in his book there are many quotes about how different states can hope to achieve dominance over the other, or to maintain dominance or maintain their hegemony over other states. So regardless of what kind of a state you are part of, Sun Tzu has something in there that will help you develop a strategy for dealing with your adversaries. So some of the more noteworthy phrases, and that gives you a touch of the thinking of Sun Tzu. The greatest victory is that which requires no battle. Probably one of the most famous dictums attributed to Sun Tzu. Another one that is used, which I think is very helpful, especially when we're talking about secret space programs. Quote, a good defender hides under 9 layers of earth. A good attack moves above 9 layers of heaven. Thus, he is able to both preserve himself and achieve a complete victory. So this is really appropriate for us today, because when we're talking about 9 layers of heaven, we can think in contemporary terms of China possessing deep underground military facilities. In the United States, we call them DUMBs. In China, they have similar facilities that go deep down into the ground, and that's where China is doing all of the research and the development of its secret space program, looking at advanced technologies, foreign extraterrestrial technologies. That's all happening under the ground. And then 9 layers of Earth. We're talking about what's happening in space. And China is doing a lot of things in space. We know of their conventional rocket program, sending a rocket just a couple of days ago to Mars, which should get there by around February. And China has a lot of other things happening in space that are very secretive. So China has done a lot in developing secrecy, both in terms of what it's doing at its most classified facilities underground and also what it's doing in space. So for the Chinese military strategist, one of the ways in which they are approaching the present struggle with the US military is coming up with the appropriate strategy for how to deal with that. So overcoming a superior adversary. In Chinese folklore, an assassin's mace is a weapon used to overcome a more powerful adversary who has superior weapons. So if we're thinking in classical terms, if you have a mace, something that you hold in your right hand and you're going to club someone with the mace, but they've got a bow and arrow, and they've got arrows that can travel a long distance and hit you. They have superior technology. Or they have a pike or something that can be thrown at you from that's a superior technology when you compare it to a mace, which is really only effective in your hand, or maybe you can throw it a little distance, but maybe not nearly as far as, say, a spear, a pike, or certainly not as an arrow. So how do you, if you possess an inferior weapon, how do you overcome a superior, an adversary who has a superior weapon? Well, that's part of this strategy called assassin's mace. So it's a strategy where you know that your weapon systems are less developed than your adversary, but you come up with a strategy for how you can most effectively use these against the more powerful opponent. So in the case of the contemporary era, the United States, of course, has aircraft carriers, battle groups that the aircraft carriers travel in, which make them quite formidable. But for the Chinese, if they develop the right ballistic missile or a cruise missile, one missile could render an aircraft carrier obsolete. I mean, it could destroy it. So that's one way in which you could actually pursue a strategy of assassin's mace, where you know that you cannot match the United States in terms of building aircraft carriers or your own battle groups. But you build lots of these ballistic missiles or lots of these hypersonic cruise missiles that China and Russia have been developing and deploying recently. And with those, you use those against the US aircraft carrier battle group, and the battle group has no defense against that. So that's an example of assassin's mace. Similarly with the US military, because it is deployed all over the world and it uses GPS for targeting its potential adversaries, the US relies on its satellite grid. So if you can take down the US satellite grid, especially the military satellites up there, then you render the US military impotent. So that's really another example of how the Assassin's Mace strategy works. So what is it that the United States military strategy is attempting to do today? Well, the US has this very different strategy because it is the hegemon, it is the ruling power on the planet. So the United States has this full spectrum dominance strategy, where the idea is that the US can dominate any potential adversary in any conceivable situation using its own resources or in combination with its partners. And that ranges the full spectrum of potential military situations. So what that is really telling us here is that the United States is using its resources, its huge economy. The United States is the world's largest economy, and is spreading that out across a number of areas to try and dominate any potential adversary in any particular circumstance. Now, the Chinese military look at this and say, okay, we cannot hope to match the United States in all of these areas. So our strategy is going to be an asymmetric one, and we are going to pursue the Assassin's Mace strategy, which is, well, the Achilles heel of the US military, which practices full spectrum dominance, is space. Because the US military, of course, is dependent on the GPS system for targeting potential adversaries. And if you take down the US military's satellite system, then you have a way of defeating the United States. So this is the Achilles heel. Now, what China is doing, what the Chinese military are doing, rather than building naval battle groups, aircraft carrier battle groups, rather than building massive strategic nuclear weapons facilities, rather than building ballistic missile carrying submarines, rather than building long-term strategic bombers, China is using its economic resources to deploy in space a navy or advanced weapons that China hopes or plans to use if the conflict with the United States ever goes hot. China will use its advantage in weapons that it has been deploying in space over the last 20 years against the United States, because space for the Chinese is the strategic high ground. It is the Achilles heel of the US military's strategy of full spectrum dominance. And so that's where the Chinese are pouring all of their resources, putting more and more resources into that. So how can China do this? Well, if we look at the respective economies of China and the US, and there's a graph that shows you how the Chinese economy is growing relative to the United States. So the United States economy is that dark blue line, and you can see how it has, for many years up until recently, had the vastly bigger economy to China. Now, the green line is a measure of China's economy in terms of purchasing power parity, which is a measure of the size of your economy in terms of the bang your currency gets. So it's really, because when we look at international markets, the value of the yuan, the Chinese currency, as opposed to the US dollar, the yuan is systematically undervalued, and the Trump administration and many presidential administrations have been upset about this. But in China, that means that the yuan even though internationally it's not that strong, and so the Chinese economy, as a reflection of that, isn't as strong. In China, your yuan is used to pay your soldiers, it's used to pay your scientists, it's used to pay your corporations to build all of the hardware. So the yuan goes a lot further in China than it does internationally. So that means when you look at China's economy in terms of its PPP, purchasing power parity, as opposed to the absolute value of the Chinese yuan, which is the red line, China's economy has already overtaken the US economy in terms of PPP. But if you use it if you're using as a measure of growth just the value of the currency, China's economy is rapidly catching up, but is still behind the United States. And estimates are that by the year 2030, China's economy in absolute currency terms will have caught up to the United States. And that actually has been very recently revised. The latest statistics show that China's economy, just in terms of the absolute value in terms of currency, GDP, size of its GDP as measured by currency, China's economy by 2024, only in 4 years' time, will become bigger than the US economy. So that's important, because in 4 years' time, these are the latest estimates from the World Bank and the IMF. China, in terms of its GDP, in terms of currency valuations, will overpass the United States. In terms of PPP, it overpassed the United States around 2016, 2017. So by 2024, China's economy, in both ways you measure economic growth, will be bigger than the United States. Now, why is this important? I mean, it's clear that this is going to have an important impact in terms of the respective military spending of China and the United States. And just notice by 2024, India's economy will become the world's third largest as well, and that's quite significant as well. So let's look at military spending. So let me move over to this camera again. So here's a comparison of China and the US military expenditure using PPP. And that's a more accurate estimate or comparison of their expenditures. Because at the end of the day, when you're paying Chinese soldiers or paying Chinese corporations for the tanks or the aircraft or the spacecraft that they're building, you're paying them in yuan. You're not paying them in dollars. Of course, for the US military, everything's done in dollars. So in comparing the US and China's military expenditures, we really need to consider that in terms of PPP, China's military, you can see from that graph, from 2003 was really just barely 20% of the US militaries. Now, by 2018, these estimates are based on 2018 figures, it's about 80% of China, so of the US military. So we can see where things are heading. Now, the thing is, keep in mind that the US military is spending its vast budget, it's roughly $800 billion a year now, it's spending that on maintaining full spectrum dominance, building the aircraft carriers, building ballistic missile equipped submarines, new bombers, new fighters. It's continuing that because the strategy is to be able to deal with any threat in any military theater at any time around the world. Whereas China understands its big threat is its main threat. I mean, China has also regional threats, but its major threat is the United States. It understands that, and it's pursuing a strategy of the assassin's mace, this asymmetric strategy. So it's pouring a lot of its military spending into a secret space program. So when we look at, and I don't have figures for this, but I can tell you, when we're looking at military expenditures for space weapons, I can guarantee that China is probably spending anywhere from 5 to 10 times as much as the United States today in terms of deploying its assets in space. And so this has scared a lot of people in the US military who are paying attention. They know what's going on, that they've seen this happening. And you can go to any military school, any military academy in the United States, and they'll look at these figures and say, absolutely, this is what's going on. And if you were China, you would do the same thing. You would focus on what is the US's Achilles heel? Space. So you got an economy which is almost as big as the United States, or soon will be bigger than the United States economy. You put all your resources into space weapons, and while the US is spending, the US military is diversifying all its military expenditure on multiple different possible theaters, China is focusing on space as the strategic high ground. So there are people in the United States that are paying attention. So this is a book that was written by a Brigadier General Robert Spalding, and he has been pointing out this information that I've been telling you, that the Chinese, in terms of their military strategy, their doctrine, their history, that they are currently in a stealth war with the United States. Now, the United States and people in the United States think that we are at peace with China because from our perspective, we are at peace. There is no major war at the moment. Now, from the Chinese perspective, especially the people running the People's Liberation Army, they look at today's world situation not as Pax Americana and we accept the status quo, we want to maintain that. They look at it as analogous to the period of the Warring States. And so they see themselves as an aspiring hegemon, and they see the United States as the dominant hegemon, the current alpha male in the kind of global group of chimpanzees, if you like. And so the Chinese military strategists, they have their strategy, they have their club ready to hit the American monkey when it's not ready. So General Spalding, in his book, The Stealth War, he lays all this out. He lays out exactly what the Chinese have been doing to develop their military infrastructure, develop their assassin's mace strategy, how they can most effectively deal with this full spectrum dominance approach of the United States. Understand that, well, it's not worth getting into a hot war with the United States over things like passage of ships through the South China Sea because the American military have prepared for that. They've put a lot of resources into these aircraft battle groups that are very mobile, and they can deal with this kind of regional threat like waterways and so forth. So probably not worth getting into a battle over that. But just keep developing your military assets, especially for those areas that are most advantageous in the long term, which is space. And then when you're ready, you deploy those. So that's the thinking. And in the meantime, the idea is that you use every tool at your disposal to be able to steal or acquire through kind of unfair trading practices, extortion, whatever it is, that you take whatever technology that the United States has developed and you secretly develop that in your own facilities, your own secret facilities, 9 layers under the earth or 9 layers above the heavens, as Sun Tzu says, all done secretly, so that the US military and the rest of the planet doesn't know what you're doing.